recording on, because otherwise I'll get into trouble for not recording the session. So we're back recording, so everybody's being recorded. Your microphones are all on mute at the moment. I'll go through this. The chat is clearly open. Please make use of that. This is very much a demonstration type session with all the risks that that involves. So I have a total of 9 slides, and I'm not going to dwell on too long on any of them, including this first one. So that's 9 in total. So there really isn't lots of PowerPoint. This is about showing you how to build a software robot. So thank you very much for joining us. Obviously, this is one of the last events of the MK Tech Fringe. Hopefully you've been along to some of the other events. But if not, most of the events have been recorded and will be available up on the YouTube channel that we've created for MK Tech Fringe at some stage next week as we go through the process of assembling all the material that's been captured. So hopefully you've got full access. If anybody has problems, send me a message in chat. I do have it open and watching, but obviously I'm going to be very much hands-on keyboard. So apologies if I'm not taking interruptions to start off with. I want to get through it, share some stuff with you, and then certainly we'll take questions much later on online if you want to, but use the chat as you feel free. So to get started, the agenda is very simple. There we go. So I want to start by talking about what is a software robot, because I know there's a variety of definitions out there. What are the benefits you'd expect a software robot to deliver? I'm then going to take you through a business scenario we're going to talk about for the build today. And we are actually going to do some of that building. Obviously, I've got some usual pre-prepared style as well, but we'll take you through some of that. We'll talk about the software we're using for that build, and obviously it's one example of the software out there. We're actually going to do the build, and then I'll just give you a few key takeaways to wrap up, which is why, as you can guess, I don't need very many slides. So it is very much hands-on. So hopefully that's what you're expecting. You know, the topic was build a software robot, and that's what we're going to do, and very much focus on doing that. So software robot, what is it? Well, really, it's software that can simulate a person working on a computer, and that's where you need to start from. Always think about it is, if a person can sit on a computer and do it, then a software robot could do it. And the software robot really does the same things as a person. It can read from the computer screen, can type on the keyboard, and move and click the mouse. And that's all it's really aiming to try and do, simulate what a person does. Now, you can use them in lots of different ways, but in reality, that's all we do. Now, somebody will say, well, you can also talk to a computer. Yeah, you can. And obviously with things like Alexa and all those wonderful devices, yes, you can. And yes, you could put that voice command into a computer that was then being picked up and run like a robot. But effectively, when you use your voice, you're really just sending instructions to the computer the same way as you'd type. It just saves the actual physical input. So the difference between a software robot and a macro. I guess a lot of people say, well, it sounds just like a macro. Well, there are some similarities, but macros are normally limited to one piece of technology. So you get like an Excel macro or a Word macro or even a Windows macro. They work in a very constrained environment, but ultimately is a software robot doing the same sort of things as a macro? Well, macros can read what's on the screen in a limited way. They can type. Not sure about clicking the mouse, but anyway, there are some similarities there, and it's not totally wrong to think of them as a bit like macros, but you'd almost say it's like macros on steroids. And I guess it's very important to emphasize this is about software running on a computer. It's not software for physical robots. There's no moving magic arms here, no things running autonomous vehicles around Milton Keynes or anything. This is about software where you can run today. So it's very much technology that is available, around for a while. It's getting better and better and can do a tremendous amount of functionality. There's also a lot of debate out there is, well, why do you need a software robot when you've got APIs, application programming interfaces? They do different things. There is a degree of overlap, yes, and you can make them overlap, but they are very different things. Unless you're a very unusual human, you aren't going to sit at your computer and interface onto a piece of software, like say Salesforce, and use its API. You aren't going to type it in and use the API for the interface. Software robots are replacing a person. That piece of software that a person might use may well use APIs behind it, but it's actually the interface is a user interface, a graphical user interface typically, but something a human can work with. And that's what the software robot works with. So it generally works with the user interface. However, software robots do have plugins and can use underlying APIs to talk to machines. So it's all about using the right piece of technology at the right point. So there's no need to really get into a big debate about it. You can use either piece of technology for the right use. And you can have conversations about which is more efficient, which is better for scaling, which is more secure, and all those sort of things. But really, if you just think about it, is you're using a software robot to replace what a person does. And if you wouldn't use a person to do it, don't use a software robot to do it. I know it sounds simplistic, but it is actually the best way to start thinking about these things. Now, because software robots are actually all about doing repetitive tasks, doing things that people will do, the term robotic process automation, what it's actually doing, if you like, gets used a lot. So you'll see if you go searching the internet, robotic process automation or RPA is clearly the buzzwords that really are talking about software robots. So hopefully that just gets a clear and consistent definition that we're all now sort of using, and I'm going to be using in the rest of the session this afternoon. So if you've got a software robot, click again, there we go. What are the sort of benefits you're going to get from it? Well, software robots are going to be used, if you like, principally because they can deliver consistency. They do things in a very standard way. If you ask any human to perform 100 tasks, a task 100 times, they will do it consistently for most of that time, but they will make errors. They're just humans. That's normal. It's very hard to do any sort of repetitive task consistently as a person. Robots don't. They're very boring in that sense. They will do what they've told to do, no more, no less. That gives you tremendous standardization. Inevitably, that improves quality because you've got consistency. If you haven't got errors, you've got consistency. And normally, fixing an error is a lot more expensive than getting it right first time. It also is loved by anybody who's worried about compliance, because one of the great things you can do with robots is make sure they log all of their activities. So nothing gets said, oh, I'll write it down later, or I'll catch up on that later. It goes through it time after time after time consistently. And that's a real value. Being a piece of software, it's not really very surprising to learn that clearly as a piece of automation, then it can run 24/7. That gives you a whole new way of looking at pieces of work. Most situations where people work on computers, up to the pandemic, you'd say in the office environment, now perhaps all working from home, but basically if people were working in the office environment, they would, on average, an office worker would be working, let's say, 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. That is a fraction of what you can do with a robot, because that same robot operating on the same PC as a person worked on can work 24 hours a day. So that's immediately 3 times more per day, and it can do it 7 days a week. So you can immediately see that you've got an awful lot of extra capacity to get work done just by automating the same tasks. That capacity is really important because very often people invest in software robots and their actual challenge is saying, I have that capacity, how do I make use of it all? Because they need to get maximum value out of their investment. There's a sort of, in some ways, a small benefit, but actually quite an important one. If you're not asking people to do repetitive work and you're getting the robot to do it, you're actually reducing the risk of harm to people. Clearly, repetitive strain injury is one extreme form of it, but wherever you're asking people to do very repetitive work in a very confined way as quickly as possible, then basically, you're putting their bodies under stress and possibly their minds under stress to get the job done. So the robots very much take away that sort of workload. And there's a sort of real benefit out of software robots that people don't always talk about, and that is that robots do not gossip. So if you've got any sort of sensitive information that you're processing through the system, It could be you've got a very important person, details going through, whether that's a member of parliament or a social media influencer or whoever. You don't necessarily want that information being leaked. Robots don't go anywhere. They don't go down the pub. They don't go home and family. They basically will not leak the information out. Yes, somebody will say you're subject to hacking. You are, but you're no more subject to hacking with robots than you are with ordinary people using computers. There's no great difference there. And in fact, one of the benefits of robots is because they will do things consistently, you can actually change their passwords every day, and you can have incredibly long passwords because people don't have to remember them. The robot can just use it, a stored piece of credential that could be 20, 40 characters long if you want to make it really secure, and it will cope with it. By getting robots to do repetitive tasks people don't have to do them, that actually means when you bring a new person into the organization, they've got less to learn. And that has to reduce the overall training cost of running an activity. And basically not asking people to work like robots is generally seen as a good thing, and makes recruitment easier because you're not giving people work they don't like doing. So against all that background, I was trying to think of the right sort of scenario we should be thinking about for building a software robot today. So I came up with this sort of approach that, given the current environment we're in, and as we look forward over the next few months, one of the things that's going to be true is we're going to likely see some form of recession. And that always means you need to have an increased need to check on your customers. You're providing them services, and very often those services are going to be charged for in arrears. Any sort of service, any sort of expected commitment from them on future orders, you need to be very aware of what's happening. So this is just a scenario. It's just meant as an illustration of what you could do with a software robot. It's got some key features in it that I think are useful to get a feeling for what you can do with robots. Clearly, it's not a full real process that you've built out in production usage. This is all about looking at a requirement, creating a robot as an answer to it, and then designing differently if you were to scale it up and look for production. But the scenario we're looking at is we get some sort of email request to perform a check. So I'm going to use Gmail today, purely because that's available to everybody, and is free. So it's not difficult to get your hands on that. So if you wanted to do something after this session, you could certainly get hold of that. Now, in a real scenario, you'll get an instruction in, somebody gets told to do something. Email is quite a common way of telling people they want something done. You would typically then go to an internal system within your company and get some of that information, details about your customer. To make it more useful, rather than me use any sort of internal CRM that other people haven't got access to, I thought, well, let's find a way of doing this in a broader approach. So the Milton Keynes Chamber of Commerce has a directory of its members. So we're going to take the email request, use that to go and find companies on that publicly available directory of companies. So anybody, again, can go and do this afterwards. Once you've got a list of companies from there, we're then going to use that information, and for each of those companies, we'll go off to Companies House, again, publicly available, to look to see what the latest documents have been filed against that company. There's nothing clever in this in terms of the business logic. It's just the way you might well have processes running within your business. Some sort of request for a process, go and find out some information internally, go and access external information to supplement it, find out the current status. So that's what we're going to be doing for the build in outline, which hopefully you'll see could easily be sort of many different tasks that you might have within your business, and certainly covers ground in terms of what can be done. The software we're going to use for this is UiPath Software. UiPath is one of the leading products out there. It's clearly what my business specializes in, but realistically there is 60 or so products in this market, of which the big three are UiPath, Automation Anywhere, and Blue Prism. They very much dominate the market according to all the industry analysts. So if you go to the UiPath software, and again, it's a good one to choose from this perspective, though the others have also started to catch up, you can now get a free copy of it. So if you go to the UiPath website, and on the top right-hand side of the banner, there's a start trial, and that then takes you to this screen. You'll see that immediately there's 4 options. You're going to choose the community cloud one because it's free, basically, and you can download it and use it for free. There are some restrictions, so you can go away and build your own robots after this using that free version, providing your company and your usage of that software complies with the license terms, which broadly speaking is companies less than a couple of £1 million worth of turnover and less than 50 users. Now, you can read all the license details in detail. That's fully available on the website. But realistically, it's about using it in small businesses. You can get the software for free. If you're a larger business or if you're getting a lot of commercial value out of it, you will end up having to pay for it because there are some constraints on it in terms of its broader use. No constraints in terms of development. What you use for development with the community edition is what you would use for development with the licensed versions. It's all about usage, not development. So what I'm going to do is start up the actual studio development in just a minute and very much take you through the process to indicate how to build a software robot. I'm not actually going to code absolutely every line of code in front of you, and we're not going to cover all of the coding I've got in the sample solution, but it will give you a feel for it. We will go and build some key bits of this in a minute and you'll get a feel for what we can do. I guess it's important to say as well, what we're talking about here is developing the robot, not how you deploy it. Because when you create a robot, you could then deploy it on 100 different machines if you wanted to, or in lots of different places. So there's all sorts of options about deployment, and we're not going to cover any of them. And we're not going to focus on about how do we make it the most robust solution possible, or trying to get absolutely all the best practices in it. This is all about getting a way of getting started. So it would get you a solution, not necessarily the solution you end up with long term. So I'm just going to stop sharing that PowerPoint if that's all right, and we'll get into actually running the robot. Let me just come up here. I'll reshare my screen with screen 1. There we go. Right, so hopefully you can all still see my screen. You should be able to see Explorer up there. So I'm just going to open up my Build a Software Robot demo. So I'm just going to click on here for a second, and this will open up the studio for me. Just take a moment to load all the plugins. Right, so this is the studio environment, and we're going to take you through this example in just a minute. First thing that I'm just going to do is actually I'm going to go back to this screen. This is some of the projects I've been using recently. I'm going to create a new project just to literally show you how simple a robot might be, and you just start with a process. So we give it a name. So creating everything for me in the background. Open up the initial process, and by default, everything starts from the main unit of work here, the main workflow, but it doesn't. You can change that and rename it if you need to. A typical studio environment, like most other tools, you've got a whole series of options on the menu ribbon here. We've got 3 key tabs here, in reality 2. The project gives you a view of the different elements that make up your overall robot environment, the different workflows you're going to create. The activities are all the range of things you can use, and we'll go into that in a minute. So the first thing I'm just going to do is actually type in here and say I want a message box. So it gives me the option of message box. I'm going to bring this with a drag and drop interface into my main workflow. So just to give you the simplest possible robot, like all good developers, first thing you do is start off with hello world. save that as a text box. You'll see as soon as you've got it complete, those blue icons, warning icons, disappear, which basically means it's okay. So I can save this and I'm going to run it. And all this will do is run as a robot and pop up that message. So Studio's shrunk. You'll see on the bottom right hand side of my display over here, the robot's running. Now this is where I say about slightly different from deployment, in that we've got Studio running and it creates its own version of a robot execution environment temporarily on your local machine. Running production mode, that robot runs separately and you don't run it alongside Studio. So there we've created something and it's executed our message box. So that's very much outbound. What I want to do now is I'll swap back and open up the main session. So I thought I'd show you the next bit in terms of actually what we do in terms of working with a website to actually click on and get information in and out of that. It's worth, I suppose, just pointing out at this stage, let's drop to here a second. We just go to Tools. In order to get the maximum benefit from the robot, you install a plugin so that it works and can understand the different browsers. So it's not adding any new functionality, it's just about how it interacts with it. And so you can do that for each of those. Clearly, I've already got the Chrome one installed. So we've got various bits of code that I'm going to work on down here this afternoon, but I'm going to create a new one for a second. And you've got different types. You've got, let's move that off there. You've got sequences, flowcharts, state machines, and global handlers. The only two you ever really worry about most of the time are sequences and flowcharts, and we'll come on to bits of those this afternoon. But I'm going straight into a sequence, and this again is just a demo of web for a second. Whoops, I told you I was typing live. Demo web. So I'm going to create a process for doing that. So the first thing I'm going to do is then, I know I'm going to use the web, so I'm going to open a browser. So I'm going to look for the available commands for a browser. One of them is open browser, fairly obvious. You've got to tell it the URL, and obviously I'm hard coding here. In a real environment, we wouldn't be doing it like this, but for the purposes of the demonstration, here we go. We've got going to eSolutions website, so nobody can complain. It's my own website. Oops. So that's where I'm going to go. But now I need to do some actions on it. Now, rather than just create them, because I know the website, I'm actually going to record them from a session. Let me just open a new browser window a second. So there's my new browser window. And we've got the website. So in fact, I'll just type it in, it'd be quicker. So let me just get it to the eSolutions website. Now, there's nothing special about this website in terms from a robot perspective. The robot will treat it in the same way. But when you build a robot, you always have to think about how you're going to create it. So here's the robot. What I want to do to start off with is I'm going to record some web activity. Now, when you're doing recording type activity, it's not a perfect science, I suppose it'd be fair to say, but it does give you a big start. So first thing I'm going to do, just for the purposes of this demo, I'm going to execute a click. So I'm going to do a click, and I'm going to click this particular menu option. That will result in the drop down, which is then taking me to the page because I didn't choose an option. And the next action I'm then going to take is another click. And I'm going to click the ROI calculator. So it's taking me to this page. Now, let me just scroll down the page. Whoops. Just moving my windows around so I can do it without losing sight of all of you. So I'm just going to come down this page, and the calculations don't matter, right? The purpose of this activity is not to show you a wonderful web page or great calculations. It's just saying there's a web page, we've navigated somewhere, we're going to interact with it. So what I'm then going to do is I'm going to type into one of the fields. I type, and I'm going to target that field. How does the browser know, or how does the system know which field to put it into? You can see it's highlighting it for me and making it easy to target exactly where I want to go. I'll show you exactly how it does that in just a second, because it's quite an important way of understanding how robots work. So at the moment, I say I'm going to type into that field. It allows me to, whoops, I don't know if you can just see that at the bottom. So I'm going to put 10 there just to change that value. I don't know if you can see it, it's almost gone off screen. Let me just, I'm just going to tell it to empty on it before I start typing. And it puts it in. So it cleared the field, then put the value in. Then I'm going to scroll down this page a bit more and click the calculate button. So again, click action, and I'm going to tell it to click that button. And I'm going to save. So what that's done is it's captured each of those events, everything I told it. Just scroll this out a bit. It's attached to the particular browser because it knows it has to find that particular page. We've got our click event, then navigates to the menu option, then inputs a value. And one of the things on there you couldn't quite see on the screen, I don't think, been hard to see, where I was inputting the value 10, I told it to empty the field before putting the value in. Okay, and there's a range of options you can do, a range of properties you can do for each of the actions on here. And then we click the button. Okay, so nothing very exciting, but hopefully it'll just give you a flavor. So if I go back to the home page, that's where we started from. So if I actually shut this down, I'll shut it down and let the robot run all the way through. So we're going to open the browser and then make it happen. So I'll just run it in debug mode a second, just in case I've got anything wrong. So you see it brings up the browser. Oh, you see what I failed to do there? It's gone to, I'll shut that down. It's gone to Internet Explorer. And that's because on here, always the risk of doing a live demo, isn't it? I created open browser. What I didn't do was choose which type of browser. So by default, it goes to IE. So I'm going to go to Chrome because that's where I was then doing the work later on. So let me just save that. You've got the options there. Let's go back to here then. So I'm going to run it again. So there the browser comes up. Get to the solutions page, click on the menu option, and it didn't run through. Okay. I know what's gone wrong there because I had the same issue earlier on. It's just doing this. And this is where you get odd things between the browser during record sessions and real life. I'm just going to do that. So it will click on it twice effectively. And it's purely because of the way the timing works with the drop down, because the JavaScript drop down on the menu option, it's still processing that and then it doesn't go off to the menu option. So we run it again now. And it's gone through, then we do the ROI page and it's completed. Now, I know it's completed, you won't have seen that. And the reason is the robot can access everything that's in the browser. So although it didn't show you, it's typed the value 10 into here because it could get to the field even though it wasn't visible to you as a human. The page was loading when it was available. And it's pressed the calculate button, so it's got the numbers here. So it's important when working with some of the robots to realize what they're capable of working with and what they're not capable of doing. The way I'm going to talk about the robot most of today is really where you'd be using the robot to run on its own, to go off and do the activity. You can actually create a robot that very much is going to interact with a human so that you can have it working away so that a human might do something like click a button. It will go off and do some action because you've clicked the button, and you as a person could be doing something else entirely different. Windows is a multitasking system and is capable of running multiple processes. So you can have the robot running in the background, waiting for the human to do something, and then responding. I'll just show you that as a very simple example in just a minute. Let's go back to clean page there, bring my robot back up. So this was purely to illustrate what we can do by building with recording type processes. So I'm just going to shut that down a second and come back to my main project. So if I go to this one, I've set up some code on here that basically says when you press Alt and M, we get a message box. It's not exciting and it's not meant to be. What it's just trying to show you is that we could trigger that robot by an action at any time. So if I set the robot to run, it will sit there in the background, not do anything until I press, you can do anything you like, nothing happening. But if I go Alt M, we get the message. So that's just one of the ways you can interact with a robot. It could be by a hotkey combination, it could be clicking on something in particular, but lots of ways. So you could have a robot working there to help a person. So some people are building robots, particularly in call center environments, where the robot is helping the agent do things. So if the agent can do less typing and less reading on the screen, they can spend more time concentrating on the person they're speaking to at the other end of the phone, not only giving them better service, adding more value, but actually making their job more enjoyable, which generally means they interact better with the customer and less typing because they've done it. The robot knows what to do once they've got minimum information and goes off and does it for them. So we've got the attended robot type scenario. Oops, let's just stop that. So what I thought I'd now do is show you the whole process running that we talked about. So I've got, let's shut that one down. I've got Gmail. Oops, somebody else just tried to join. I've been ignoring them for a couple of minutes, so just let them in. So I've got the whole process that we talked about in the scenarios. I'll just go back to that PowerPoint a second and refresh your memories on that. So we're going to do Gmail, then Chamber of Commerce to get a list of companies, and then go to Companies House. So I've got some code to do Gmail. I've got some code to do Milton Keynes Chamber of Commerce. We'll go to that in a minute. And then we'll do a check Companies House. Now, as I say, I'm not going to try and show you absolutely every line of code here. We wouldn't have time for that, not in an hour and a bit and a few questions and stuff. It just, we couldn't get through it all. So what I've got though is a little way of showing you what's happening. In a production environment, you would normally get sensitive log-on information for the robot from the cloud part of UiPath that manages the licensing of the robots, the scheduling, and the overall control of them. And that stores all the credentials in a highly secure vault type environment and sends them down in an encrypted form to the robot when it runs. So although I've got it set up to do that here, I've actually overridden it with just a local set of information, and I'm giving it one of my demo Gmail accounts. And all I'm doing in the robot is saying get IMAP messages. It's very simple. So that the interface to actually go and get email, obviously IMAP is a simplistic type of interface onto email. You can interface to Office 365 and other email systems and do far more complex control. This particular setup, I'm just going to get my Gmail messages, and not in this case, I'm not going to mark them as read. I'm only going to read unread ones and just bring them into the system. Now, when I get them, obviously it could be more than one. So I'm going to loop through each of those messages. Now, this is where you then get into some specifics, if you like, to get the individual bits of a message out. Each email message has obviously got a from address, a to address, and a whole lot of other things could be attachments, images embedded in the email body, etc. So you need to know how to process a message. So you do need to understand how programming is put together for that. But just from a robot perspective, one of the things I'm doing is logging messages. I do a lot of that, you'll see throughout this, just so that when you're debugging, you've got a full breakdown of what's gone on. So we can see what it's reading all of the time. So I've got the from and the to, and I'm pulling out the different pieces of the message. Let me just show you the Gmail itself. As a test account, so I know there's nothing too sensitive in here. So I've got very simplistic email, and obviously this could be a realistic email, would be much more complicated. But if it's an instruction coming to something, it might be quite simple, and it might be very structured, or it might not be. So you can, fully analyze pieces of text and use a plugin for analyzing that for natural language processing if you want to put that sort of sophistication into this technology. But all I've got here is a very simple saying, please check companies starting with the letter E. I know that's realistic, but for the purposes of the demo, it is an instruction and it's got a value. So, and we keep it, the whole point of this is to keep it simple enough we can get through it in the time scale today. So let me shut that one down. Next thing we're going to go and do is I said we're going to go to the Milton Keynes Chamber of Commerce website just to act as a source of information, and that's all it is. There's nothing special about this, and there's nothing really significant about the companies I've chosen on here. So I'm just using the publicly available, and oops, I've obviously just closed the window. I didn't mean to close, but anyway, I'll come back to that. And I'm just using the publicly available directory, and in this case I'm looking for all of the companies under the letter E, and each one it finds I'm then going to go and look up the details of that company. So for example, it will drill in and get the details for that company. For this particular example, we don't really need those details. All we want is the limited company name, but it just creates more realistic scenario to go through. Let me just pop that back up there, and because my chat window has just shut on me as well. There we go. All right, it's all right, just in case anything was happening and I hadn't seen it. So we're going to go through for each company. We then go and get the details. What we're then going to do is go to Company's House. We're going to take those company names. So for example, I'm going to search on Ether Solutions. There's top entry, finds it, go to the filing history, and I'll just scroll down here. And you'll just get the latest document, okay? It's all publicly available information, so I'm not breaking any rules or causing any GDPR issues or anything like that. So let's shut all that down. So the robot's going to do all of that, and it's going to do it in sequence. I've showed you the Gmail part. I'll take you through some of the other bits in just a minute. But I thought what I'll do to start off with is now actually run the robot. I said everything starts in main, but obviously I've tried to also be a bit more flexible. So from main, I call another workflow, in this case, one I've called overview. Now my overview one is actually a flowchart. So it basically goes off and it checks the Gmail. If I've got something to process, it carries on down this path. If I haven't, I just finish. Nothing to do. And the idea of showing you that is that in reality, when you build robots, one of the things you look to do is build some sort of repeated process in there. So you break things down into bits that will work, have to follow each other, and things that could run in parallel, things that could wait for things to happen in a different sequence. And this is how you can build scalability and get maximum usage out of your robot. One robot processing 24 hours a day is unlikely to be used to process the same thing again and again. It's likely to be given different bits of work at different times of the day or different times of the week, depending on what the requirement is. And it doesn't necessarily have to be by a schedule. It can just go around looking to see what's on its queues of work that are available. So in our scenario, we've got the email being checked. If we've got an instruction type email, then we go to the Milton Keynes Chamber of Commerce website to get all the details, and then we go off and check the individual companies. So I thought what I'd do is I'll literally run it for you from the start. You'll see the screens flash up, and I'll talk you through some more of that as it comes through. Interestingly, if I just run debug, assuming we don't get any big failures here on the demo. This starts it does the Gmail read. It can get the IMAP without actually bringing up any screens. We go off to the directory. We now drill down through each of those in order. So it's going through, picking them up. And this obviously is dependent in terms of performance of the end website, how fast that responds as well. And the robot's pulling out the details. Here, loop through all of them. And I've chosen this because there's a reasonable number in there, but not an excessive number. And obviously this could be going through your CRM or any other system. It's just a way of illustrating working with a different application. And when it's got all of that, it then opens up Excel and saves all the information into it. And it saves it in there and it will format it. And I'll show you some of that in just a minute as to how that's achieved. And because we're running it all through, formatting it up reasonably, this was part of the demo capability, Excel finishes. We finished Milton Keynes' website. We've now got another piece of that robot process that goes back and opens up this Excel spreadsheet. Oh, I don't know if you can see that. It's adding a couple more columns into it. I think they're being hidden by my display of people. Then read through some of those items and we'll go to company's house. Oh, come on. Like all demos, just failed. I think I'd clicked at the wrong time trying to remove the display. Okay, I'll run it through again in just a second anyway, but it will loop through. Just go back to here, just stop that. Yeah, I couldn't find something. Just stop that for a minute. So I'll take you through the bits. We'll run it through. It's run multiple times this morning in practice, so I'm sure it's just me interfering with the screen at the time that stopped it running then. So I showed you the Gmail. We pulled it through. Let me just show you a couple of things we're doing in here. We're pulling out the information. If I go to the output file, actually, you can see here it was reading through the Gmail account and was looking for the text. In this case, it was 3 lines of text. I'm reading it in plain text, and then I extracted the letter out of it to drive the rest of the process. So let me just put that back down to there. So that's what we're doing in the Gmail. The only things that were going on in there that sort of perhaps are more complicated is breaking the body text up by line. So we're actually doing an extraction of it into an array structure, and then looking through each element of the array, looking for a particular word, in this case called letter, and then finding the characters that are after that. So nothing very exciting, some basic programming really, but necessary work. On this piece where we're accessing the main website, one of the things we did was slightly different to the way you do it as a person, because as a person, you probably would go to this website and go through clicking each entry and then coming back. That's slightly inefficient because you're having to load this page of directories, company list, every time in between each page. So what I did, just to optimize it slightly, it's only a slight tweak in terms of processing, and you could do it as a person, it's just possibly more difficult, is in here I basically build a table of ready to receive all the entries. So we go off and we get all of the entries off that page, extracting the structure out of it, and then loop through each of the entries I found and navigate specifically to the individual pages. So it's a slight change to the way the person would work, possibly, but it does make it more efficient because you're just driving page after page after finding the initial list. Finds all the details, but one of the things you would see, and you probably didn't get a chance to see as it ran through so quickly, but if we go to this one, for example, the sort of information you get here does vary compared to the next one in the directory. Whoops. So that if we go to, I don't know, let's go to this one. You get different amounts of information. Some have got a fax number, some of them haven't. Some of them have got a description, some of them haven't, some have got a website, so you get some variation. So one of the things that's quite important when you're putting these robots together is, yes, you can build it up on the, if you like, the happy path, the things that make sense that you expect to be there, but you've also got to cope with the unexpected. So for example, what we do here is this piece of code that is saying, get a particular field from the screen. But it might not exist. So I've put it within what's called one of these try catch blocks. So if it exists, it's fine. If it doesn't exist, what are we going to do about it? And in this case, I just assign a value of none to it. So nothing very clever, but it just copes with errors, because when you're dealing with most of the websites and a lot of other systems, things won't always be perfect. And I guess that's one of the things that you need to be very aware of in terms of building the robots. If everything is perfect, it should work. When things aren't perfect, key thing with a robot is not to do any harm. Stop. Far better to stop, let somebody else check it, come back and start again, than actually leave things in a state where they're not as good as when they arrived. So very much a question of not breaking anything, if you like. So safety first is just stop. And you can try to build in as much functionality to cope with errors as you like. So we've got checks against, does the phone number exist? Now, one of the things I forgot to tell you earlier, I showed you highlighting, but I didn't then go back to explain how you do that. I'm going to open up something called UI Explorer. This is just one of the tools that comes with UiPath. Oops, opened it twice. So if I go to indicate an element on the screen, let's say this phone number, which is something we know we're just going to extract. What this does is it analyzes the page. In this case, it's a web page, and how it's identified that field. So it's looked through the whole of the web page, which has got headers and bodies, and if you know HTML, it's got the whole makeup of that page in terms of the document object model, as it's called. It's looked through all the bits and worked out what it thinks is a reasonably unique combination to explicitly get to that field in the shortest possible definition. You can change that, okay? And there are reasons you want to change that at times, because clearly if you build that selection on something, let's say you said I want to have it where, in this case, you can see the program is, I don't mean to be critical, all right? We all make mistakes, we all could do things better. But the programmer has actually used the value effectively within the column name and within the name of the field, and it's the inner text. It could be better, all right? You'd ideally have that field described with its own unique name, not just populated with a value. So, clearly there are always things that could be better, but you need to work with what you're given. So, you can select that field in lots of different ways. By doing that, that allows us to find that particular field on this particular page. And that means robot can be quite precise about what it's going to get. Of course, it's not always there, and that's why you have to have that try catch bit. It's also worth perhaps just saying where we're talking about that. Let me shut that down for a second. I just want to show you one other thing. It's not just true of web pages. Anything running in a Windows machine can be accessed. So if we use our Explorer and I want to say I'm going to want to get to click that particular element for some reason, I don't obviously, but it just gives you an indication. It identifies it by naming the Windows application, WinMerge in this case. It's in what WinMerge knows as its toolbar, and it's looking for something with a name of new documents. So you can be very precise, even if you're dealing with some Microsoft Access or some other application that's running on your PC, not a web page at all, not a cloud hosted application, whatever it is, you can still interact with it. By getting that definition of something like that, if we have a look here at this field, open this up so you can see it, that same definition, and this is how it's actually getting that phone out there, is looking for a row name of phone and the table column of 2 in this particular case. That's the way I've coded it. And the reason I coded it like that is it's more flexible, because shut down the WinMerge, bring this screen back up. Oops, sorry, this screen back up. If we go back to indicate, bring my browser back up, would help, wouldn't it? Onto here, I'm going to indicate that phone element again. That gives me the elements, as we saw before. It was just identifying it as the element there by the value. But if we look what's actually here available to us, we can see we've got just above that, the element we're picking up, we've got this table structure being there used to identify the way the information is being laid out. So I can say I want to use that, and I can take out the parts I don't need, but you can see I've got my table column and table row, so I can pick it out partly on position and then add other values into it. So that just allows me to be more precise about what I want to pick up, because clearly as you go from different members, the actual value will change. So what you want is that field coming out of there, even if it's not actually displayed neatly as a field. So the robot's able to do that. It's able to identify it by the structure of the page. And that's a very resilient approach, because the way anybody's built anything, if it works with Windows, Windows has to know how to display it. So you've got the core applications out there. In this case, it's a browser. So Windows has to know what to do when it gets a browser piece of code. And then within the browser, it uses the document object model, which is common across all browsers, for explaining how an HTML page is put together. So if you can read the structure, you can then find the values. So that's the way it does it. And that's why they use this term selectors, to actually find your way around the different parts of a screen. And that's also why, even if you can't see part of the page, if it's got stuff here, it's not visible, but it's in the document object model. Why, when we were processing that page of Ether Solutions where I was doing the return on investment calculation, the fields were in the page even if they weren't visible on the screen. And you can control whether or not it can access those, but if it doesn't have, you don't have to wait for it to be visible. As long as it's in the page, the robot can access it. And the robot generally can interact with the screen at 10 times the speed of a person. You can always say it's give or take, but rule of thumb. And that's purely because the robot is able to react far faster, type more accurately, and actually move on to the next piece quicker than an individual human could do. So that's given you a sort of flavor, hopefully, of how you identify bits of the process. He says, I'm running out of time. I knew that might happen. So let me just shut this back down. So we've got a flavor of what we're doing to extract it. Let me show you something then that you saw when the robot was running. It accessed Microsoft Excel. Okay, not, it's a desktop application. No reason why it shouldn't work with that. As I've said, it can identify selectors. One of the tricks you can use very often with processing applications on the desktop and also websites is, as a human, you'll work with it and you'll look directly at it. However, there is a sort of law out there about accessibility, and that means people who are visually impaired or less able to interact in some ways have to be supported. So the better programs, not all of them, the better programs provide support for accessibility. Now, you can make use of that when you're developing a robot. So for example, on Excel, when you hit the Alt key, you get access to the next range of functions as single letters. So if I hit the Alt key and then do F, it gives me a whole range of options such as S for save. So if I do that as a keystroke combination, it's easier and more predictable than moving the cursor over that item, hitting File, then hitting Save. So there, you can do it any way you like, but looking for accessibility options is a good way of doing it because it's resilient. One of the important features of that is if you've got Excel displayed like this, and if I then shrink it right down like this, so you've got its shape is different. Some of your options start disappearing. The size and layout on the screen could be different, but accessibility will still work. So even if I'm looking to do something, I can often get to the menus just by hitting the accessibility keys and following that path. So it's a different way of working for the robot that can be more robust if there's other things that mean you get a difference between operations. So if you run it in two different PCs, your screen resolution might be different, your layout, your default setup for Excel might be different, but very often you can still drive it in exactly the same way just by using the accessibility path. So I'll show you that code in here. So if I just go to Milton Keynes extract, you saw we extracted all the data, checking for whether or not it exists. Don't worry about all of that. There's things like closing tabs, all that sort of thing. I didn't show you, but hopefully we'll see it in a minute. I actually limited the number of companies that I was then going to process through Companies House, just to filter out bad data. And if I run it again in a minute and it goes okay, I'll explain why. You can do file deletes, so you can manipulate files on your system. So this is doing a delete of a file, so each time I run it, it cleans up effectively after itself. Writing from the data table that I was stored earlier into Excel. But there is one of my accessibility type commands. So I'm typing into it and I'm pressing the Alt key. So that's the key, the Alt key, and then an F and an S. So it just means that it's a robust way of interacting with the system, but it's a useful way for doing it on some cases. So let me have one more go just running this native. Then I'll going to open up the lines just in case there's questions. I'm happy to keep talking, but I said I'll do about an hour, people through it, an hour and a half in total, obviously, but I want to give people a chance to have some questions along this because I've covered an awful lot of ground. I do appreciate that. And clearly there's not time to go through absolutely everything. So let's go back. We'll go back to here and we're just going to run it. Let me just check I've got everything else shut so I don't have any conflicts. That's okay. Excel's not open. So we'll just run this now. So we go off, which will check my Gmail, and I know I've got some email to open items up. Goes off to the Milton Keynes directory, obviously just going for the letter E because that's the only instruction I've given it. It'll whip through all of these. And you can start to see some of the information there is variable quantities as we go through the different items. There's the spreadsheet, and you can see it running through, doing all the formatting. Being able to read and write spreadsheets alone for some organizations is a real benefit. Yeah, and this is the bit that's hiding behind the screen, so you probably can't see it very well. It's just adding an extra couple of columns in. There we go, it's repositioned so you can see it now. Oh dear. There we go. Typical, isn't it, when you run Zabo? That should run through and do that. That was doing it only 10 minutes before we started. So unless I've typed something by mistake. So my apologies, that's not run through. Right, let me open up the lines so people can unmute themselves and talk if they want to. Just go here.
deeper to scan.
Okay. Right. I'm just going to allow you to unmute yourselves. So if you want to ask any questions, just unmute yourself and let me know. Somebody was asking, is there any specific use cases for business verticals? Well, I guess software robots' strength over the last few years has come from automating bits in finance departments, because they typically have an awful lot of repetitive work that is to do with keying data, cross-checking data, and robots, because they're doing repetitive work, are very good at actually looking for differences. So if you've got to do a bank reconciliation, for example, and you've got thousands of entries in your bank account over a month, checking them against your system is a laborious task. Now, I know some sophisticated accounting software will do it for you, but that's just one example. But robots will go through. They're very good at finding the needle in the haystack, whereas humans will get into a pattern and skip a few. And those could be the very ones you want to highlight. So auditors particularly like some of these robot type techniques to actually go and repeatedly analyze information to look for differences. So they can be used anywhere. You know, we've seen a lot of stuff going into CRM systems, a lot of stuff to do with HR and following compliance policies, because again, you need to make sure it does the same thing again and again without fear, favor, or anything, no bias. It will just do it. And that HR, like that aspect. Operations, we've seen a lot of it go into everything from logistics and scheduling systems and cross-checking things like stock levels. So you might have an ERP system, but what happens when you need to do something special? You know, does the robot highlight when there's sort of something going wrong because it's done some background check? The key thing is it tends to be work that you would be doing with people, but the robot can do it instead of them and free them up. But it really does then depend on how you respond to the opportunity, what you do with that free capacity. The other thing we see people doing is getting robots to do things they would never get round to doing, such as credit checking. So we did implement a credit checking solution for a client recently, a manufacturer that used to take credit data from Experian once a month and run it against their files and update them. The information from Experian is available on a daily basis. They're paying the same price for it from Experian. It's just they only got round to processing it once a month. Now they've got a robot that takes the information daily, updates all their credit records on a daily basis rather than on a monthly basis, reducing their risk. You know, and as we go into that difficult period of trading, that could be worth an awful lot of money to them. I'm just having a look at the other ones. Saying, do we get any problems with complex dynamic JavaScript heavy websites? They're more complicated to develop with in terms of when you're trying to identify what's going wrong, and that company's house might well be what's caused it there. It just becomes more difficult to find the right combination of definitions, the selectors, to identify the right elements in the screen you want to interact with. There's nothing inherently more difficult in the end result. Once you get it right, it will continue to be right until something changes. Somebody was then asking if you've got a robot capable of performing different tasks, how do they know how to schedule it or what to do? Well, one of the things you can do with this sort of technology is you have queues of work. So you can simply think of it as you put a particular task into the queue of work and the robot's just constantly working through that queue of work. It doesn't really care what it does next. It just takes whatever it is off the next item off the list. As long as it knows what to do with it, it can then do that. So on one occasion, it might be doing something for a finance department. Another occasion, it could find something that's got to do for the HR department. It could be anything. So and you can have multiple queues, you know, and you can have multiple robots. And as you get bigger deployments, it really then becomes the right balance, finding the right piece of work and allocating it to the right number of robots to get processed in an appropriate time. It's all part of deployment really, rather than development. Somebody's asked, is there a cloud version of the Studio for Designer? No, the Studio is very much a desktop implementation. It's meant to interact, can interact obviously with web systems, and when there's a cloud element to it that controls the running of the robot. And you can, and we have frequently deployed a virtual PC, if you like, in the cloud, and then studios run, being used for development, and the robot's running on virtual machines in the cloud, but it is a desktop type implementation. There is a way of running Studio on a Macintosh, if that's a hidden question behind that, for those Mac users, but it's not the native platform. You know, being blunt about it, UiPath might want to say, oh yes, of course it work on a Mac. Yeah, it works, but not as well. It is a Windows-based development, and they're a Windows-based development team dealing with Mac when they come across it. I think that's probably the best way to think about it. Any other questions? Somebody's then saying background screening on during recruitment. I need to check licenses against databases. Yes, external databases checking. Yeah, very much so. As you can imagine, we went off to company's house there for doing it. You didn't see all of that because it failed, but it can certainly do all of that sort of activity out there for doing that. Clearly, the basic building blocks of what you get with a robot, you then have to put it together. As I say, you can go to UiPath today, download the Community Edition software. They've got an academy of training material, all of which is free at the moment. They keep talking about charging for it, but at the moment it's all free, and you can use that. Lots of training material out there from third parties on UiPath, some of which is free, some of which you pay for, but you can learn how to do it. It just takes time. You know, there's as a business, we implement UiPath, so we do it all of the time, know how to use it, but there's absolutely nothing to stop somebody else out there going out there and acquiring those skills. It's just time and effort and inclination. Absolutely, you can make use of it. Somebody else has asked, is there a way to write code rather than use the visual block interface? No, not really. In fact, one of the things I run is an RPA meetup group, and one of the other vendors in the marketplace, a company called G1ANT, like giant, but G1ANT, they don't have a graphical user interface like the Studio development tool that I've been working with and showing you. They're very much a text line based editor, if you like, for putting the code together. And they were turning that around, rather saying that's a weakness, that's a strength. So almost to answer your question is that if you want that sort of interface, there are those out there that do it. UiPath, no, it really doesn't. I mean, you can export these structures that you're generating in the editor to Excel, so you can see the underlying structure, but you can't really develop with it. It's not. It's an export of the definition, not a way you could easily compile it. It just doesn't hang together very easily like that. Somebody said, what happens when the trial version finishes? Well, the community edition version, there is no lifetime on that. Community edition is free. They've said it will always be free. Like I say, you can use that. So as a small business, you could take that community license and keep using it. If you take a trial version from an actual trial version from UiPath, that is limited to a period of time. That's got more capability in terms of what you can do with the robots from a deployment point of view. So you can have more deployment options than you can with the community edition, but the community edition is there, it's available, and if you build it in community edition, you will be able to keep using it in community edition. And it's the latest version of the software. So it's not behind, it tends to be ahead, if anything, because you can get glitches where they've released software that has an issue with it, and part of the price you pay for the community edition is that you're doing some of the testing for them. So occasionally that can cause you a problem. Anything else from anybody else we got in there? Have I missed anybody's questions? Like I say, if you need to unmute and ask it, please do. Looking through, I don't think I've missed anything. Somebody's asked, could we provide more details about the robot on natural language processing? The capability for UiPath is constantly being extended, but they work with a large number of partners. They've got a fairly open structure, so it's very easy for them to plug and play, interface with other people's technology. So it can interface with things like um, Google products, it's Microsoft Flow and Google Dialog. I forget what the ones are. But it can interface to most of those products. And they do have a very clear strategy for running AI in particular. So where you need to bring in AI capability, although UiPath is developing some of its own capability and providing some of it, it is expecting to constantly be able to interface to other people's products. So people have demonstrations out there today with interfacing onto things like Google technology for doing NLP processing, or some of Microsoft's technology and IBM's technology. So you can actually plug in their processing for natural language, get the results of that, bring it back into the robot to take the action with the results. So it's some of those sort of things. Once you get into some of those AI bits, some of those are additional costs around the UiPath model. So it is worth bearing that in mind. And clearly, if you're using third-party products, they're going to have some sort of costs associated with them as well. Somebody's asked, how do you compare UiPath versus the other products out there? It's one of the top three. You know, there's always, whichever analyst you go to, basically UiPath, Automation Anywhere, and Blue Prism are the top three, normally by quite a way, or depending on who you look at. You get other ones popping in at number 4, 5, and 6 and stuff, but generally those three are recognized to be the top three out there. It swings and roundabouts. If I was, you know, if you're talking to UiPath salesman, he'll say it's the best thing since sliced bread. I've been around IT long enough to know that if you're in the top few, yes, there'll be tweaks one way or another. Somebody will do one thing better than the other one. There's not a lot in it. You can always build reasonable solutions with any of those top three products. So, you know, you're talking about minor features, to be honest, I think, just like you'd be talking about differences in database technology. You know, it used to be a big thing which database you went with. Now everybody accepts they're all pretty similar unless you're in a really extreme use case scenario. So I'm not avoiding the question, but you really need to go and look at the industry analyst for some of that. Somebody's asked about using R&D funding. Yes, we have done that for clients. It's a big issue, obviously, at the moment. There's a lot of people out there trying to go and get your R&D tax credits back. Well, the good thing is investing in these sort of projects will almost certainly qualify as R&D spend, so you can get funding for that. You can often get matched funding for it because a lot of government initiative is supporting innovation, and this comes under innovation. We've also seen people saying, well, okay, there's the cost to buy the licenses, cost to do development if we don't do it ourselves. You know, there's effort that's got to be put into it. You know, the total project cost is X. How do we do that? Well, we've already worked with people to do licensing on some of this, so people will do it on a lease type arrangement, so it'd be financed. And I've written blog articles which simply says, you know, Ether Solutions gets involved in helping you create that solution because, you know, it's good for you, good for us. And clearly with any of these sort of things, the benefits are the usage. It's a subscription-based price for UiPath rather than perpetual license. So it is an ongoing cost, hopefully against ongoing benefit. But that does mean you want to scale your robots up. You don't buy all your robots on day one, unless you're trying to get a big volume discount or something, and you build them up over time. So it can be quite low cost to get into, or relatively low cost. And obviously, if you use the community edition license initially, there's no license cost to start off with. So you can keep the costs down. You can certainly get R&D funding against this sort of development work, and you'll certainly be able to finance, package it up if you want to get the benefits. So lots of options for doing some of those sort of things. Anything else I haven't told you about? One point I didn't perhaps show you. Let me just show you one piece of coding. You probably guess how this works anyway, but we've got, as I was going through checking the companies, it reads out the Excel. What it's then doing here, and this was perhaps something I didn't talk about, we passed an Excel file by writing it out and then reading it back in. You can also pass parameters between items of code. So here we're passing, let's just make that window a little bit bigger, a company name in, to the process to go and search company's house, which I know you didn't see run, and then it gets back the latest date for the document and latest date, latest description for that document. So it input and output parameters between bits of code, as you'd expect for any quality IT solution, really. So you can certainly do that. So you can pass things around as you'd expect and divide up bits of code into sensible blocks. Small point, I know, but I suppose I ought to mention it up here as well. Try and get my cursor back to move. There we go. You can annotate, put comments in wherever you want to in the code, so that you can actually document as you go along. You can also change, though you saw me drag and drop items onto the page, as part of the properties, you can change the name of everything. Excuse me. So you can, and you should, for good practice, I guess, document everything as much as you can. Let me just sort of wrap up them, I guess, with one final takeaway type slide. I said it's minimum PowerPoint. Site Studio, the studio development tool that you've been seeing, is very much a developer environment, and you can capture processes as you go through with the recorder, and then you make them general. You capture it to way of getting an indication what you need to do and then do it. The big emphasis on this is happy path development. The easiest way to make it work is focus on the bits that will work if everything else is right. And you've got to set expectations around the sort of typical 80-20 rule. It's a typical IT project, I know, but lots of effort can go into handling errors. And people are very good at adapting to them. Robots do things consistently. And if it's not what they expect, they won't like it. So the key thing is the robot must be set to sort of do no harm. And if in doubt, stop. Don't let it run away, because it will click. If you've given it instructions to click and there's a page that's come up that you didn't expect to come up and it now clicks on it, what's it done? It could be deleting files, it could be doing anything. So it's always about check, recheck where you are, do the simple thing, and if it's not certain, stop. Might not be optimal from that point of view. It's better to stop that task and go on to another completely new task than to keep going and risk damaging something. So it's very much happy path development and then taking it from there. Any other questions? I think I've gone through it all. As I say, if you want to unmute yourself, you're more than welcome to. You should be able to do that at the moment.
David, it's Mick.
Hi, Mick.
Hi. This is great. Thank you. I've seen this earlier, and that's it was a very good introduction, and it's similar to the way you or the way I implement funnels in CRM. If a small business wanted to implement these themselves, do you offer training? Is there training available?
There's lots of free online courses available from UiPath. So if you're asking as a business, do we offer formal training? We don't offer formal training courses. There is a company operating, I think, out of Czechoslovakia, or no, whatever it is now.
Right.
Clear. Provide courses in English. They're sort of a bit close to the edge of the UiPath license on some of that. What we will do is work with people and do knowledge transfer. And I don't mean to split hairs on that. It's just if you define a formal training and do it, you might be breaching our partner license with UiPath, because they will run formal training courses themselves, which obviously are expensive or relatively, but they try to say it's all available up on our free academy. Why would you come and pay us to do it? Go and read it yourself and watch the YouTube videos. So we have to be careful that we're not trying to make money on the gap. So yeah, we're happy to do hand-holding knowledge transfer and more training.
Okay, cool, thanks.
It's just asked what the skill level required for creating a robot is. Well, it's a bit of programming. The studio actually comes, they're extending the range from UiPath. They've got what they call a citizens studio, Studio X. I'm not sure it's necessarily a good name, but anyway, they have that for people who are, they would say, is more business focused and less programmer focused. And they're also taking the studio environment and enhancing it for large team development. And they're going to call that Studio Pro. That's coming in the next few months. where that's very much integrated test environments, code management and everything for large scale team development. Generally speaking, as long as you're a reasonably experienced programmer, you will pick up things. It's built on Microsoft.NET. It uses, as you saw, most of the technology phrases in there are not dissimilar to the sort of phrasing people see for doing other developments, you know, assigning things, signing values, typing, clicking, sequences to group things together. You know, there's a for each loop. You know, there's nothing that's really that radical. And if you like, you can always make a guess. You know, so if I said just to let's just type the word triggering, just for the example, it gives you a list of all the actions you could be using. So you can find your way around with a bit of, if you've developed in some other language, what verb, what statement would you use in another language? See if it exists here, you know. So you don't need, I would say, dramatically new skills, sensible programming practices, how to divide things up, all good programming standards, you know, naming variables with a consistency. I didn't even get to show you variables and stuff, but you've got variables you define different formats. In fact, that's one of the slight weaknesses. Let me point that one out to you. Compared to one of the other products out there, UiPath, because it's built on Microsoft.NET, they do tend to be quite specific about their variable types, and transferring values between variable types requires explicit conversion. Whereas in some other technology, it's much more of an object-based, and it does all the sorting out of the different value structures behind the scenes. That's, you have to do that much more explicitly in UiPath, which is a strength because you know what you're handling, you know it works, and you know what you've done. Weakness is you've got to define it and build it. But in terms of any sort of programmer should be able to pick this up, to be quite honest. And I think that's all. Have I missed any other questions in that list? So yeah, if there's anything else you want to ask about afterwards, obviously we're putting this session up on the MK Fringe YouTube site, so happy to do that. And if you've got any other questions, of course, by all means, give me a contact afterwards. I'm sure most of you have got my details one way or another. So please follow up with that. Go to the UiPath site, download the software, look at the academy. It's a lot of information out there. But I think the key thing is looking about where you could use it effectively. Look for where people are spending time doing repetitive work, or whereby doing that repetitive work, you're adding value to the business. You know, what else could you do if you had more hours in a day? And that's always a good challenge at this current business environment. Thank you very much. We're really right out of time at this point. So thank you very much for your attention and your questions. And like I say, more than happy to follow up with anything else. Thank you all. Bye. Hello again. This is the actual demonstration running in full. So you can see it complete the whole process. So we just run it now. So as you saw during the main webinar, the robot goes off and looks at Gmail, pulls back the email that contains the instruction, starts performing the instruction by going through the Milton Keynes Chamber of Commerce website, in this case looking for companies with the letter E as the starting name, goes through each of these web pages in turn, extracting the data, and once it's completed it all, it will then go through and build our Excel worksheet. You may also notice as it goes through these different pages, the amount of information available against each company does vary. Things like fax numbers are not always there. So here's the Excel worksheet being built. Doing some formatting to make it look more sensible. Then we're going to open up the Excel worksheet again, add an extra couple of columns. to hold the information that we retrieve from Company's House. So this is the part of the demo that failed to work online because I had an extra window open. My apologies about that. Here we go, going through a couple of the companies that we extracted from the process, and it's only doing a couple of companies to keep the length of the demo reasonable because it all takes time to execute. And there we go, it's completed the whole process. So if we just go to the Excel worksheet, and here's the one we've just created. And if we come across to the right-hand side, you can see we've captured information about the date of the latest document and Company's House and the document's description. So nothing very exciting, but it does show the demo actually works in entirety. Thank you very much.